My Craigslist experience turned into a real nightmare. I needed to sell my old SUV, an Isuzu Trooper. It was in a rough shape, and fixing it would be too expensive. Plus, I needed a truck bed, so I decided to list it on Craigslist. I posted some pictures of the SUV, described its condition, and set the price at $500. I also added my phone number for interested buyers. Shortly after, I received a call from a guy who offered $200 for it. I declined, explaining that the rims and tires alone were worth $200. He argued that it would just be a heavy piece of metal in my driveway. Frustrated, I told him I might consider parting it out to make it worth my while. But this persistent buyer wouldn't give up. He started texting me relentlessly, even raising his offer to $250. I couldn't block his messages on my basic prepaid phone, and he was driving me crazy. Finally, I found a buyer willing to pay $450. We set up a meeting to finalize the deal and transfer the title. Then, the relentless texter struck again. "I'll give you $300 for that Trooper," he texted, to which I replied, "Sorry, I just sold it," hoping he'd take the hint. But he persisted. "How much did you get? I'll beat it by 50. Fed up, I typed, "I sold it for $450. Out of nowhere, he countered with, "I'll do $475. At this point, I was confused and reminded him that he initially claimed no one would pay more than $200. His response left me dumbfounded. "Well, you seem like a nice kid. I'm just trying to help you out." Frustrated beyond belief, I texted, "I'm turning off my phone for the weekend once the truck is gone. Stop texting me." And then I actually had to turn my phone off. But later that night, my car alarm went off. I rushed to the window and found nothing, just the howling wind. Then, I heard glass shattering at the back door. I grabbed a hockey stick and approached cautiously. When I reached the door, no one was there, just the door swaying in the wind. At this point, I couldn't decide if I should close the door first or call the police. Somehow, I didn't listen to my instincts and went to close the door. As I went to close it, I was suddenly stabbed in the shoulder from behind. I collapsed, and the intruder shouted angrily, "Where are the car keys?" At this point, I realized it's the same person I was talking over texts, and refused to sell him the SUV. I pointed to my room in terror. He ransacked my room, took the car keys, and fled. I dialed 911, but my vision was blurred, and I barely explained to the officer about what happened. Gave him my address, and after that, I don't remember a thing. I woke up in a hospital bed with a police officer by my side. He handed me the keys and told me they had caught the intruder over a bridge near my house. His house was searched, revealing a history of similar crimes involving Craigslist transactions. Luckily, I hadn't become another victim of his dangerous schemes that night. In 2011, a seemingly innocent job posting on Craigslist turned into a terrifying tale. The ad offered $300 a week and a 2-bedroom trailer in exchange for taking care of a large farm in southern Ohio. It sounded like a dream job, but it soon became one of the most infamous stories of online crime. The Craigslist had read, "Caretaker for farm, required for watching over a vast 688-acre hilly farmland, feeding some cows, and a preference for older single individuals." To sweeten the deal, they offered relocation. Person must have a clean record and must be trustworthy. It promised a permanent position in a remote, beautiful location, mainly used as a hunting preserve with wildlife and a stocked pond. The nearest neighbor was a mile away, making it an ideal getaway. This job opportunity seemed too good to pass up. Scott Davis responded to this ad on October 9, 2011. 4 weeks later, he found himself gazing past the car window. Acre after acre of Ohio farmland, dotted with cattle and horses, each patch framed by rolling hills and anchored by a house and a barn. He rode with his new employer, a man known only as Jack, and his so-called nephew Brogan. Over breakfast in Marietta, Ohio, Jack chatted about his life, preferences, and his church. He interviewed Davis and also asked what he had brought with him, and Davis boasted that his trailer was full from top to bottom. After breakfast, they drove to the Food Center Emporium in Caldwell, where Davis left his truck and trailer to be picked up later. They continued their journey along paved roads, which eventually turned to gravel and then to dirt. Davis watched as the bars of his cell phone's signal vanished. In a densely wooded, hilly area, Jack told his nephew Brogan to pull over. Jack and Davis got out of the car, and Jack seemed lost, suggesting they return to the road. As Davis began to walk back, he heard a click, and then word fuck. Turning around, he saw Jack pointing a gun at his head. Davis instinctively shielded his face with his arms. The second time, the pistol fired, shattering Davis's right elbow. Despite the severe wound, Davis managed to escape. He ran for his life through the woods for 7 hours until he found a house and asked the owner for help. The police were called, and news of the incident began to spread. 5 days later, a woman named Deborah Bruce contacted the police. Her twin brother, David Pauly, had also responded to the Craigslist ad. Sadly, his story took a tragic turn, ending with the discovery of his body, along with another victim named Ralph Geiger, buried in the woods near the place where Scott Davis had been attacked. A pattern emerged as investigators realized that Jack and Brogan targeted vulnerable, middle-aged men with limited family connections. They lured them with the promise of a life-changing job opportunity, only to rob and shoot them. By selecting victims with few family ties, they believed they could avoid attracting attention to their disappearances, giving them time to dispose of the bodies and evidence. Some candidates were rejected during the interview process, further exposing their sinister plan. The police traced the Craigslist ad back to a man named Joe Bays, who rented out his basement. Although Bice denied posting the ad, he believed it was done by his tenant, known as Ralph Geiger. A phone call from Bice to Geiger led investigators to the real culprit, 52-year-old Richard Beasley, who had been on the run. Scott Davis identified Beasley as Jack, the man who had interviewed him at the restaurant and later shot him in the woods. Beasley had been using different identities to evade capture, even adopting the names of some of his victims. His teenage accomplice, Brogan Rafferty, was arrested and found guilty of his involvement. They discovered weapons and a chilling poem hidden in his computer files from August 16, 2011. The poem began with, "We took him out to the woods on a humid summer's night. The loud crack echoed, and I didn't hear the thud." Investigators later determined that the poem described the murder of Ralph Geiger, one of the victims police had found in the woods. In the end, Beasley was sentenced to execution after being found guilty of 27 total accounts of aggravated murder, aggravated robbery, kidnapping, and possession of illegal weapons, while Brogan Rafferty received life imprisonment without parole. This seemingly innocent job had turned into one of the most notorious luring posts in Craigslist's history, contributing to the platform's shady reputation. This story unfolded last summer when I was 18 years old, living with my mother in an apartment just outside the city. I had recently moved in and needed to find some furnishings. A coffee table and a TV stand were on the top of my list, but I wasn't in a hurry and didn't mind searching for a few weeks. One Tuesday night, after returning from work, I was scrolling through Craigslist and Facebook Marketplace for potential furniture. I came across a TV stand that caught my eye. It was affordable, in good condition, and not too old. I showed it to my mother, and I decided to send an email to inquire. To my surprise, within seconds, I received a response from the seller, Dan, saying he could sell it to me that very night. He mentioned he was moving out and planned to dispose of it in the morning. I had nothing else to do that evening, so I agreed. My mother and I decided to drive over to pick it up. I finished my meal, and we embarked on the 30-minute journey to the address Dan had provided. The neighborhood was unfamiliar, with dimly lit streets, barred windows, and graffiti under bridges. Most of the houses were in darkness, but we knew it was late. Upon arriving at the small one-story house, one of the few with its lights on, I rang the doorbell. When we heard no response, I knocked. Suddenly, a window opened, and a man's voice instructed us to come inside as the door was unlocked. I went to open the door, but my mother sensed something was off and whispered her concern. "Are you sure you want to go in there?" I reassured her and cautiously entered the house, calling out for Dan. The interior was dimly lit, and I moved closer to the voice. The man's voice directed us to join him in the basement for the transaction. Just then, my mom stopped me, clutching my shoulder, and whispered, "That's it. We're leaving." That's when my mother and I decided to leave in a hurry. As we rushed back to the car, a concerned woman from a neighboring building approached us. She warned us not to go inside, shared her worries about the man next door, and told us that random cars frequently visited his driveway late at night. She asked why we were there. We described our encounter with Dan, that we came to pick up a TV stand, but he was calling us into his basement. To which the woman said she wasn't certain if his name was Dan, but vaguely remembered him introducing himself as Peter. She advised us to steer clear of the house and get as far away as possible. We heeded her advice. The whole situation was unsettling, and it's chilling to think that my mother and I might have walked into a dangerous trap if we had ventured into that basement. Why would we conduct a transaction before seeing the item or agreeing on terms? The entire scenario seemed suspicious, and I shudder to think about what might have happened down in that basement.